Good day, and welcome to part 2 of our study of the book of Galatians. Last week, in the first part of chapter 1, we related how Paul, in this letter to the churches of Galatia, revealed how he came and preached the gospel that was given to him by God and by Jesus Christ. And then he was amazed at people coming into the churches so soon after he was there, preaching a somewhat different philosophy and stating that they had to continue, the people there had to continue in the laws of the Jewish religion as well as in the grace of Christ. And he was now upset with this because of the fact that this was not the gospel that he had given them, and this was not the gospel that he preached. And he was giving his reasons for why the gospel that he preached was the true gospel under which people should live. So we said this at the very first of the chapter, that he was given this through Jesus Christ and not from men. So now in the second part of this chapter, he goes on to say this: "For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I still please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ." He is stating that he didn't come to make concessions to men or to make allowances for what men wanted in order to persuade them into Christianity. He said he didn't come to persuade men. He came to give them the gospel, which they accepted or not. He didn't come to make concessions or to make ways that are pleasing to men. He wanted to please God. And what he's really saying, that you can't really please both men and God. He said if he pleased men, he would not be a bondservant or a bond slave of Christ. And this really goes along with what's said in Luke chapter 16, verse 13, when it says, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." And this is what Paul is saying. He didn't come to please mankind. He didn't come to please the people in the churches or to make concessions to them. This was the gospel he preached: Christ's crucifixion and resurrection and God's grace. And this was the gospel that he was going to leave with them, and nothing else was to be added to it or taken from it. Then he goes on to say, "But I make it known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ." So what he's really emphasizing again is that the gospel that he preached, the gospel of God's grace, he didn't receive it in instructions from somebody else. He didn't read it in a book. He didn't get it from some other teacher. He got it directly from Jesus Christ. This is what he's claiming. And this is why he's saying that this gospel of grace, the gospel of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, is the only true gospel. Nothing else to be added to it or to be taken from it. And this is why these people who have come into the churches preaching that you have to add something to the gospel was making him so upset. And then he goes on to prove why he is so adamant about what he's stating. "For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers." Paul goes on to relate how before his conversion, when he was known as Saul, he was high up in the Jewish religion. He was a Pharisee. He was wealthy. He was prosperous. He was powerful. He was prestigious. He was taught by Gamaliel, one of the highest ranking teachers in Judaism. He had it all in his former life as a Jewish member of the hierarchy, member of the Sanhedrin, and a Pharisee. And he put it down this way, that if anyone else thinks he may have confidence in the flesh, I more so. Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, concerning the law of Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, concerning the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. He was high up. He was about as high up in the Jewish hierarchy religion that he could possibly be. And he had it made as a member of the Pharisaical and of the Sanhedrin. He was prosperous and he was powerful. And this is his former life. This is what he was before his conversion. And he said this is why he knows this came from no other man. He was trained in the laws of Judaism. He was trained in the ways of the Jewish law. And he said, before I was converted, before I met Christ, this is what I was. I was in the law. I was perfect in the law, according to him. But yet he still was not happy because he had to persecute the church. People persecute other people because they somewhat feel anxious, or they feel threatened, or they feel guilty. And Saul, at that time, as he was known, persecuted the Christian church dramatically. So he said he was advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. The traditions and the laws and the rituals of Judaism he was expert at. And he knew this, and he was very, very good at it. But then he says, when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb, and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Paul did not like Christians. He persecuted the church. He was known to be one of the chief persecutors of the church in Jerusalem. And when he finished, or when he persecuted all the people he could in Jerusalem, that's what he was going to Damascus for, was to persecute and bring back Christians from Damascus to Jerusalem to persecute them further. This is when he met Christ on the road to Damascus. And now he's saying he met Christ. There was no doubt in his mind. He met Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. And now he's talking about how God had this plan for him, even before probably he was born. And Jeremiah 29:11 puts it this way, that I know the thoughts that I think towards you, thoughts of power, of pleasure, and not of evil. So this is what he is again sort of referring to, as this idea that God knew in advance what he was doing. And God chose Saul to do his work, to preach to the Gentiles, and knew this probably before Saul was even born. So he says, when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb, when it pleased him. Up until this time, Saul was persecuting the church, but when it pleased God to call him and to reveal his Son in me. Now there's a difference between revealing someone in you and to you. Many people know who God is, know who Jesus is, but there's a big difference knowing who he is, knowing how Jesus is to you versus how he is in you. And this is what happened. Paul now was revealed by Christ in him, and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles. So that this was the walking order, so to speak, that Saul was given. God called him through Christ to preach Christ to the Gentiles. And this is how he formulated and started the churches in Galatia that he was now writing this letter to. And this is what he said after this happened. After he had this conversion, I didn't immediately go out and start preaching. I didn't go out and confer with people. I didn't confer with other teachers or other leaders. I knew what I had to do through Christ. And he said, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were the previous apostles, who were still living, who were still there, who were still active. He didn't go and confer with them and say, what is this? Is this right? Is this wrong? Because he knew what was right. He said, I did not go to them, but he went to Arabia before he returned again to Damascus. Now, there is some difficulty in the timeline of him going to Arabia and then back to Damascus. It says in the next verse, then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter. Now some commentaries state that he was in Arabia, in the desert, for 3 years and conferring with God at that time. The same way God taught the other apostles for the 3 years that he was on earth, so he gave Saul, now known as Paul, 3 years with him in the desert. Then he went back to Damascus. So the 3 years that he's referring here is the 3 years he spent in the desert. Now the Bible doesn't state that he spent 3 years in the desert in Arabia, but that he went to Arabia and then up to Damascus, and after 3 years went to Jerusalem. Now is this 3 years in the desert and 3 years again in Damascus, or 3 years altogether? It's very difficult to be certain because different commentaries give different reports. But there was a period of time in the desert in Arabia before he went back to Damascus, and then he went up to Jerusalem after at least a total, perhaps 6 years or a total of 3 years. It's hard to determine. But after a period of time, he went from there to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James. These are the only 2 people that are mentioned. And he stayed there just 2 weeks. And then he went to Syria and Cilicia. What the important thing is that he took some time to consolidate his feelings, to consolidate his teachings in his own mind, without being influenced by other people and other people's ideas and other people's wants or desires. He did it through himself, only conferring with God. So this was entirely separate from other people, other instructors, other leaders in the Jewish faith or in the Gentile faith. He went up and did this because he conferred only with God. This is what he was saying, that this came from God and not, he wasn't taught it or it did not come down to him from mankind. So he says, I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now concerning the things which are right to you, indeed before God, I do not lie. So Paul is now stating that he is bringing this message, and this is the true gospel, the true good news of Christ's death and resurrection on our behalf. And through this and God's grace, we are then in favor or have favor with God. Nothing else, nothing added, nothing less. And he is saying that this is very true because it was given to him by God himself. He conferred with God. He did not get it from mankind or from any other teacher. And it shows in his own life as he being a chief of the Pharisees and of the Jewish religion, blameless, as he said, in the Jewish law. This is what he was before he suddenly was converted, met Christ, and now he's completely different, completely opposite. He's preaching the grace of God and not the law any further. It's not to say that the law has no place, because it does. Because the law tells us how we transgress. If there was no law, there'd be no possible transgression of the law, and therefore essentially no sin. But since we have the law, we know where we transgress it. We know the fact that we all sin. We all have transgressed the law, but the law itself will not change anything. It's only Christ's blood and God's grace that can do that. So then he's saying, after these things, I went to Cilicia and Syria. And although he wasn't known to the churches of Judea in person, they heard of him. They heard how he had formerly persecuted the church, how he had apparently changed, and how he was now preaching the faith, preaching the system, preaching Christianity, the faith which he had previously tried to destroy. And because of this, God was glorified. This is the whole message of God's grace. It changes people. It changes people from legalism into an act of grace and faith. And this is Paul's message to the church in Galatia. Don't be swayed by these so-called Judaizers who are coming in and teaching that you had to add something to God's grace in order to be saved. That was not the grace that Paul knew. That was not the grace that Paul received. That was not the grace that he was teaching. The grace, there was one grace, and that was God's grace, personified through the sacrifice of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, as the firstborn of the dead. And this is what Paul is trying to get into the churches in Galatia. This is the way it should be. This was the true gospel. Christ came, Christ died, Christ was resurrected. Belief in him, the faith in that, through God's grace, saves people. It says in Ephesians that we are saved by faith through grace and not by works. Everybody is equal in the sense of receiving God's grace. Not everyone is equal in the amount of works they can do. So it's God's grace without works that is really the saving feature. The works we do comes because we have a relationship with Christ, not in order to win that relationship with God. And this is what Paul is still trying to teach and trying to emphasize through these verses in the first chapter of Galatians. So that pretty well sums up what he's trying to say in this first chapter. So next week we'll get into the first part of chapter 2. I hope you'll join me for that. In the meantime, bye for now, and hope to see you next week.